And Dr. Gray is on the stand. We are outside the presence of the jury. Anything before we begin?
Just briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
In relation to Exhibit 1, those are Dr. Thompson's records. And as I was anticipating using those records with Dr. Perper, I noticed that one of the records from the medications that he ordered at the hospital wasn't included in that. And so I believe by stipulation we've addended Exhibit number 1 with one more of Dr. Thompson's records, and the state has also indicated that they may have additional ones too, which we'll certainly cooperate with if necessary.
That would be, I'm going to look at it tonight, Your Honor. If it needs more completion, then we would do that, but otherwise I've stipulated to adding that.
So no objection to this addition today?
No objection, Your Honor.
Very good. Let's have the jury in.
Your Honor, I also failed to ask 2 questions that I'm going to ask prior to cross-examination.
Thank you.
Ms. Latham.
All rise for the jury.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll go back on the record in the matter of State of Utah versus MacNeill. Mr. MacNeill is present with his counsel. The state's attorneys are present. The jury is now seated and Dr. Gray remains on the stand. You may conclude.
Dr. Gray, I failed to ask you 2 questions before we broke for lunch. Number 1, did you come to an opinion as to Michelle MacNeill's manner of death?
Yes.
Was that different than Dr. Fricke?
Yes.
What was that?
I certified the manner of death as undetermined, so I changed it from natural to undetermined.
And how did you come to that conclusion?
I came to that conclusion because of what I felt the possible role of drugs were in her death, meaning that if drugs were a factor, this was not a natural death.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You may cross.
Just following up on that last question, if drugs were a factor, it was not necessarily a homicide either, correct?
No, I did not feel that I could reach a conclusion of homicide.
With or without consideration of the drugs?
Correct.
You had a lot of opportunity to work with Dr. Fricke, correct?
Yes.
And you observed her work?
Yes.
And she was a very competent medical examiner?
I believed so, yes.
And you've gone over her work in this case, correct?
That is correct.
You believe that she did a thorough job?
Yes.
And you didn't see anything that she did inappropriately?
Not that I saw, no.
And you didn't see that she had been influenced by any outside source in relation to her opinion?
Not that I saw, no.
You certainly didn't see anything that Mr. MacNeill did that could have influenced her opinion improperly.
Objection,
correct?
speculation.
He may answer if he knows.
I saw nothing.
And In relation to your certification of the manner of death, well, just generally, it's not uncommon for you to have a case in front of you or a body in front of you, and if you feel the circumstances lead to the conclusion, to certify homicide as the manner of death, correct?
I have done that in many cases, yes.
This case didn't lead you to do that, correct?
I didn't feel I had enough to be able to justify a certification of homicide.
And in relation to drowning, you were requested by the investigators in this case to consider drowning as a possible cause of death, correct?
Yes.
And you declined to find drowning as a cause of death, correct?
I wouldn't put it that way. What I would say is I didn't see enough for me to be able to make a diagnosis of drowning.
And you've written letters to the Utah County Attorney's Office about your opinions?
I think emails, not letters, but whatever, communications.
Yes, communicated, thank you. And you indicated that your examination of the lungs indicated that you didn't see significant aspiration, or you didn't see evidence of significant aspiration of fresh water in the lungs?
I did not.
And you indicated that you don't believe that resuscitative efforts alone would have eliminated other potential signs of drowning?
Eliminated, no, but confused, yes.
And you've indicated that in relation to the assertion of expelling water, that without knowing what the contents of her stomach were prior to her death, that you can't make conclusions in relation to the full significance of the report of vomiting water, Michelle's vomiting water? That was a long question.
Yeah, I'm sitting here going, okay, now what is this? I got the information that there was an expulsion of water when first responders were trying to resuscitate her. The actual source of that water, I do not know. Whether it was stomach, whether it was in her lungs, I cannot say.
But your examination of the lungs didn't lead you to believe that she had inhaled significant amounts of water, though, correct?
It wasn't my examination of the lung, of the slides, the microscopic slides, and Dr. Fricke's description of the lungs didn't have enough findings for me to say, oh, I know this is an aspiration of water kind of a situation.
And you certified the cause of death in this case as being an arrhythmia, correct?
No.
That's probably another bad question. You believe that the cause of Michelle's death involved her having an arrhythmia, correct?
What we're doing is we're confusing cause and mechanism again.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The cause of death that I certified was that it was and I'll read it specifically as I said, combined effects of heart disease, parentheses, hypertension, myocarditis, end parentheses, and drug toxicity, parentheses, diazepam, oxycodone, promethazine, and zolpidem. That was the cause of death that I certified.
And the mechanism leading to that cause, you believe, was a terminal arrhythmia?
Certainly would be a reasonable expectation, yes.
That's what you believed to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, correct?
Most likely, yes.
And that's what you certified?
No, I certified it as the cause of death. The mechanism of death certainly could be arrhythmia, and to my mind is probably the most likely mechanism.
And in reviewing Dr. Fricke's observations in relation to the autopsy, as well as the slides that you were able to personally review, you observed a number of factors that would place Michelle MacNeill at an increased risk for having an arrhythmia. Fair statement?
Yes.
The mild myocarditis that you mentioned is one,
Yes.
correct? Hypertension.
Hypertensive cardiovascular disease, yes.
And the hypertension cardiovascular disease, would you describe what you
What
meant by
the
that?
issues were? Okay. So in hypertension, it means high blood pressure. So your heart is squeezing harder to get blood through the system. As with any muscle, the harder you work it, the bigger it's going to become. And what was found in Michelle's heart was it was heavier than normal, and the thickness of the muscle walls was increased. So it was a bigger, heavier, stronger heart. One of the concomitants or complications that can possibly arise from having a bigger, thicker heart is an increased risk for developing an abnormal rhythm or arrhythmia.
And that's because it interferes with the electrical function of the heart?
Essentially what can happen is that the electrical pulses through that muscle can go wonky because of the increased mass.
And that's completely unpredictable, correct?
It can be unpredictable. It can be a first-time lethal event, yes.
And mild myocarditis is not something that is typically able to be diagnosed without an autopsy being done, correct?
Or taking a biopsy of the heart and looking at it under the microscope while the person's still alive. That's another way.
Okay. So save a biopsy or an autopsy, fair to say that while somebody's alive, not likely to be diagnosed with mild myocarditis.
Not likely. That is correct.
A third risk for an arrhythmia that you observed in relation to Michelle was a potential, well, not a potential, that she had a prolonged QTC rate on her EKG that was done a week before, on March 29, 2007.
Okay. Yes, that is again, is a possible risk factor for developing an arrhythmia.
And you've got Defense Exhibit Z, I believe, there in front of you.
Uh-huh.
Do you recognize that?
No. I'd have to look at the records to see if it's the same.
Okay.
It's an EKG. It's basically a tracing of an EKG, and it seems that it came from March 29th of 2007, confirmed by Dr. Welch.
And does it have a name on there?
Yes, it is. It is an EKG for Michelle MacNeill.
And I believe we have a stipulation for its admission. We'd move to admit Defense Exhibit Z.
Any objection?
No objection.
Defendant's Z is received.
And Dr. Gray, the QTC, or the corrected value of the QT in that EKG indicates that Michelle's QTC was 476.
6, yes.
And that is in the range where she would have an increased risk.
It is an increased QTC. I'd have to check to see where it falls within the range of what is considered within normal versus potentially dangerous.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Ray, I'm showing you a couple articles from the American Journal of, what was it, Cardiology, and then one from the American Heart Association.
Uh-huh.
See those? The first one on it has a discussion that's highlighted.
In the first page with
On the first page?
under the abstract and back.
Yeah. And that discusses the risk of an increased risk of an arrhythmia in relation to a QTC in a woman greater than 470.
Well, it doesn't, let's see, it doesn't specifically say in a woman of a particular age, but it certainly says, yes, prolongation of the QTC interval has been associated with ventricular arrhythmias.
And that there is a threefold increase in the risk when you're greater than 470.
Yes, that is also a line that is highlighted. Specifically, it says an abnormally prolonged QTC interval greater than 450 milliseconds in men, greater than 470 milliseconds in women, was associated with a threefold increased risk of sudden cardiac death.
You wouldn't dispute that.
Nope.
Even though it's a threefold increase, it's still fair to say that in trying to predict an arrhythmia, it would be a very low risk.
It's still, even though the risk is increased threefold, the chance of it happening is still very small.
And obviously in your profession, the people that you see typically have had an adverse event, which led them to die. Fair statement?
Yeah, I see the worst outcomes.
You see the worst outcomes. And so somebody that has a QTC of 476 and lives until a ripe old age would not typically come across your desk.
I might not, yeah, I probably would never be aware of it.
And you've indicated as well that there are two medications that Michelle was taking that further would potentially increase the QT.
The risk of an arrhythmia because of a prolonged QT, yes.
And those would be the Percocet and...
That would be the oxycodone and potentially the promethazine.
Okay, potentially, okay. Even with those two medications on board, the risk remains low.
That is correct.
And it's not something that you would believe that even a doctor could predict.
With any degree of certainty, no.
You also found in your review of the autopsy that Michelle had left ventricular hypertrophy. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm. And what that means is when I was talking about how the muscle gets bigger and thicker, hypertrophy means bigger growth.
And the left ventricular hypertrophy also increases the risk of an arrhythmia, correct?
Yes.
That's a finding that can only be made on autopsy generally.
No, that could be made in life with both on EKG. They might see some signs of it. Certainly could be made with a sonogram, an echo of the heart. Could also make that diagnosis.
Okay. And you also found that Michelle had atherosclerosis or stenosis of the ostium of the heart?
Dr. Fricke found that there was mild blockage of where one of the arteries that supplies blood to the heart itself was narrowed a little bit. She described it as mild.
And that also could increase the risk of an arrhythmia?
It could, yes.
And the autopsy also indicates that Michelle had what you call steatosis or fatty liver?
Yes.
And fatty liver is also known to increase the risk of sudden death?
Yes, in severe cases, usually in alcoholics, there is an increased risk of sudden death that seems to be correlated with the fact that their livers are just packed full of fat.
You're not aware of any evidence indicating that Michelle was an alcoholic, right?
No, none.
And you don't know what the cause of her fatty liver.
No, it can happen in a number of other situations. It doesn't have to be due to alcoholism. We see it in diabetics. We sometimes see it in obese patients. Sometimes it can develop for some reason that we just don't understand or know.
Sometimes it can develop as a side effect to certain drugs.
Yes.
Fair to say that all of these circumstances went into your consideration in making your conclusion about the mechanism of death?
About the cause and mechanism,
Cause and
yes.
mechanism? Sorry, I was trying to use the right word.
Yeah, cause is something that I'm more able to say, yeah, I have evidence that is physical that allows me to say these are the findings that are reasonable for the cause of death. Mechanism would be, in this case, is purely speculative.
You were first approached about this case in approximately August or maybe early September of 2008, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were given what you previously described as oodles of information to review?
Yes.
And upon reviewing that information, you ultimately sent an email back to your investigator, Alan Sidaway.
He was my chief investigator, yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Objection, foundation, just timing here.
It's not offered yet, so if you can lay foundation.
And you sent this email on September 30th of 2008, is
Yes,
that correct?
that is correct.
And you designated the case number in relation to Michelle MacNeill.
In the subject line, yes.
And in this email, you indicated that you have reviewed the supplementary report and associated materials along with the autopsy and tox reports, correct?
Yes,
You also reviewed the original investigative report,
correct.
and that would have been the one that came from the Utah County investigators?
From Spencer Cannon, yes.
And then also you had reviewed the investigative reports that came from the Utah County Attorney's Office investigators, right?
Up until that point, yes.
And then you also reviewed Maureen's extensive case notes.
That is correct.
And then you indicated that while the investigation subsequent to the victim's death raises questions about the possible role of her husband, there is nothing in the autopsy or toxicology findings that proves her death was from an unnatural cause.
Correct.
And that's what you felt at that time, right?
Correct.
And you go on to say the autopsy findings certainly provide evidence of natural disease that could explain death, correct?
That is correct.
And you state the lung findings are non-specific and do not make me suspicious of drowning, correct?
Again, that's what's in the email, correct.
And then you state the drug levels detected are not sufficient to explain death and are not indicative of an intentional lethal overdose.
Correct.
You felt the drug levels were low, right?
They were not, I felt that they were not indicative of an intentional lethal overdose. That's what I thought.
And in September of 2008, you declined to amend both the cause and manner of death, which had been certified by Dr. Fricke, correct?
That is the last line of the email, correct.
And over the next 2 years, you had a number of contacts with the investigators from the Utah County Attorney's Office, correct?
Correct.
And I believe that you described today that...
Are we going to enter, or is this going to be entered, or do you want to do that now?
Object on hearsay.
Leave it at that. I think you answered the question. Over the next 2 years, you had a number of contacts
That is
with the Utah
correct.
County investigators. And ultimately, in October of 2010, you modified the cause and manner of death slightly.
That is correct.
And you've previously testified that the basis for modifying it wasn't because of new information in relation to the toxicology report, but it was because you thought about it some more and thought that the medications ought to be included.
Yes,
Correct?
that is correct.
And thinking about it some more was after you had met, actually right before October 6th of 2008, you met with the investigators in your office, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And they worked hard to try and persuade you to change it. Fair
They gave
statement?
me an
Overruled, he was there.
They gave me an extensive and in-depth presentation of what they thought proved that this was a homicide.
And so you ultimately agreed, oh, well, and they also told you that they wouldn't be able to proceed, they told you it would be difficult to proceed with a homicide case in light of Dr. Fricke's report.
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled, it's for the effect on the hearer, correct?
Correct.
I do not specifically recall the conversation, so I can't say if that allegation was voiced. I certainly knew that a prosecution in the absence of a medical examiner finding supporting homicide would be difficult, yes.
In the addendum that you made, you were very careful in the wording that you used, correct?
I tried to be, yes.
And so you used language like the drugs could potentially,
Yes.
and perhaps like you've described Dr. Fricke's use of the word appears, you used coulds and potentiallys to hedge a little bit on what happened, right?
To basically say, I can't prove these are possibilities that must be considered, but I cannot prove. That is correct.
And you recall testifying at the preliminary hearing,
Vaguely.
vaguely? Yeah. And at the, let's see, may I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Thanks.
If you turn to page 1265. And
I've got
so it's fair to say that it's your opinion that in relation to the water being expelled, that in order to make firm conclusions, you would have to be able to look into the lungs or see what was in the stomach beforehand?
Let me read the context, please. Okay, yes.
And And if a person had an arrhythmia, you believe that they could inhale a little bit of water, but not much, correct?
Yes.
And that if a person had an arrhythmia, that
Let's put that in context. If they had arrhythmia and then went with their head into the water, yes.
fair statement, thank you. And usually within 10 to 15 seconds, that would be about the maximum time you'd think that they could possibly.
Death from an arrhythmia could happen very quickly. Cessation of breathing would not be instantaneous. That is correct.
Okay. And in fact, you indicated that within 10 to 15 seconds you would pass out, but you may not stop breathing, but you would be unconscious.
Yes.
And regarding the volume of water that could be inhaled in that circumstance, you have no idea.
It really would depend on how deep their breathing is.
Fair to say, Dr. Gray, that that based upon your experience as a medical examiner, that you cannot take a post-mortem heart blood sample and make conclusions as to when medication that is identified in that heart blood sample would have been consumed ante-mortem?
Objection outside the scope, direct.
The sustained.
May I address that, Your Honor?
You may.
He's
I
made
ruled.
statements about the potential effects of.
Objection.
of
It was speaking
oh,
objection. I don't think it's-
Okay, maybe approach?
You may.
Certainly didn't mean to.
The court's ruling is vacated. The question does not exceed the scope of direct. You may proceed.
Dr. Gray, fair to say that it's your opinion that you cannot say what post-mortem levels of drugs were based upon a post-mortem heart blood sample?
I think I know what you're asking, but you asked a question that is actually non-answerable because you asked me if I can't tell post-mortem levels from post-mortem levels. If you mean ante-mortem levels.
I say, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Basically.
Let me re-ask the question that I'm...
Or if you want me to interpret it as you're asking about what is an ante-mortem level's relationship to a post-mortem level?
I'll try and do better, Dr. Gray. I'm sorry. And so it's fair to say that it's your opinion that you cannot make a conclusion about ante-mortem levels of medications based upon post-mortem heart blood samples.
I think that doing such a thing would be fraught with error.
And similarly, you cannot make conclusions regarding when a medication detected in a post-mortem heart blood sample was consumed.
You would have to make a number of assumptions and then apply various mathematical formulas, and the accuracy of that process would be solely dependent upon your assumptions.
And fair to say that in your forensic science community, that process is not generally accepted as yielding reliable results, correct?
It really does depend on your assumptions and whether one accepts the accuracy or limitations of those assumptions.
But fair to say that generally in your scientific community, it's not accepted that those assumptions can be reliably made. Isn't that correct?
I certainly don't do that. If I'm asked, can you tell me how many pills this person took based solely on a postmortem level, I'll say, well, that's so fraught with error. I can give you a number, but I don't know what it means.
And you're not aware of any peer-reviewed literature that would support the reliability of such a process, are you?
I'm not familiar with it, no.
In the autopsy notes of Dr. Fricke, she has a description of, a chart identifying medical interventions on Michelle's body. Is that correct?
You're going to have to show me what you're thinking of because I can't remember.
May I approach?
You may.
This is her original one. Oh, okay. Okay. So what you have presented me with is one of the documents in Prosecution Exhibit 51. This is a body diagram with notations made by Dr. Fricke while she's doing the examination.
And in that exam, she documents that there was an IV, an IV in her left arm.
Left forearm, that is correct.
And she documents that there were needle marks in the top of her right and left wrist, correct?
Right hand, correct.
Right hand.
And then also a what's called an intraosseous infusion device, which is where they stick a needle into the bone marrow of usually your leg, and it's a way of quickly getting fluid into the body. So that was another port or access point.
And so it would be standard in an autopsy to examine the body and look for any unexplained needle marks, correct?
Yes.
And Dr. Fricke didn't identify any needle mark on Michelle's body that was not explained, correct?
Nothing that she indicated that she thought was suspicious or may not have been due to resuscitation.
And in this case, we know that Michelle was given an IV by the paramedics, correct?
Correct?
And we know that the emergency room took at least 2 separate blood gases, correct?
Correct.
And those reasonably would be taken from
Usually from the anterior wrist.
which is marked on there, right?
Yes.
And then we also know that they did a intraosseous line, as you mentioned, which was,
In the left shin.
and there's also a notation on there about an attempt to do a femoral line as well.
Yes, there's a notation of a needle puncture wound in the right groin region.
So other than those that we've identified, there's no other identifications of needle marks, correct?
That is correct.
You were asked by the Utah County Attorney's Office to review your findings again in August of this year. Is that correct?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
And you were sent additional reports about alleged statements of Mr. MacNeill, correct?
Yes.
And those were reports that you hadn't considered in the past.
They were new to me, yes.
And in response to the request that you consider reviewing or amending again your manner of death, you wrote Investigator Robinson on August 6, 2013, correct?
Yes.
And in that email you said, Jeff, I have reviewed the materials you sent. While the different interviews certainly add to the suspicion that Dr. MacNeill caused or played a significant role in his wife's death, I don't find anything in the materials so compelling that it overcomes the lack of physical evidence from the autopsy that would prove Michelle was a victim of homicide. Correct?
That is what it reads, yes.
That's what you said, correct?
That's what I have written here, yes.
That's what you believed, right?
Yes.
And then you go on to say, conversely, there is nothing in the various statements that I could say are obviously inaccurate based on the autopsy findings, right?
Yes.
And you say, I don't know how we could either prove or refute the contention of a rectal route of introduction for some of the medications found in her system, beyond noting that the drug concentrations are not very elevated.
Correct.
And that's again stating that the medications were not high in a way that you would think that would indicate an intentional
Lethal overdose.
lethal overdose.
Correct.
That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may redirect.
Dr. Gray, you found drug toxicity as one of the factors, along with the heart disease, that caused Michelle MacNeill's death.
Yes, I certified her death as being the result of the combined effects of her heart and her drugs.
And the drug toxicity means what again?
An adverse effect of a drug on the body.
And when you're talking about those drugs, you identified the 4 drugs.
That is correct.
In your addendum.
That is correct. They were listed as the drugs that I thought were at play,
Oxycodone,
correct?
promethazine,
Correct.
I forget all.
Diazepam and zolpidem.
Zolpidem. And there was also nordiazepam in her system.
And I thought that that nordiazepam was most likely there because of the body's breaking down of the original diazepam.
Okay. You indicated that nordiazepam is a
Metabolite.
metabolite. It's also something that can be taken separately.
Yes.
And so its presence in the blood had some kind of an effect as well.
It is an active metabolite. That is correct.
So that, in addition to the 4 drugs you've identified, were active in her blood.
Yes.
Okay. You indicate that you were careful with your language in your addendum.
Yes.
Were you also careful with your language in response to this email in August of 2013?
Yes.
And that's reflective of the alleged statements by the defendant to
Yes.
others about the cause.
The reported testimony of others concerning what they heard from the defendant.
And you said it didn't have an effect because it would not change the physical evidence derived from the autopsy.
I don't think I said it changed the physical.
Would
It
you
does
mind-
not. It does not overcome the lack of physical evidence from the autopsy.
Okay. So the lack of physical evidence from the autopsy,
Correct.
that's what's compelling, most compelling to you in making a determination as the cause and manner of death.
Whoa, we got way, way out there. The lack of physical findings in the autopsy.
I probably asked a bad question.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, does what these people are saying they were told by the defendant, is there anything in the autopsy that can prove those statements? No, there is not.
Okay. And as a medical examiner, the most important evidence for you that you're looking at to determine the cause and manner of death are autopsy findings. Is that fair to say?
They are certainly central to the determination, yes.
Earlier we talked about evidence of motive is not generally considered.
It's something you will think about, but it, again, doesn't necessarily overcome a physical finding at autopsy. I mean, somebody may confess that they shot somebody, and the person doesn't have a gunshot wound. Well, that's a pretty pointless confession.
Okay. If someone confesses to drugging up the decedent, getting her into a bathtub, holding her under the water, and it's a credible confession, or a credible statement, would that have an effect on the determination of the cause and manner of death?
How do you define credible? That's the question.
Sure. And therein lies some of the limitations on a medical examiner,
Very much.
determining the credibility of some of the evidence.
Right, and that's the job of a judge or a jury in a trial.
Thank you. You talked about some of the difficulties because of post-mortem redistribution in determining levels of the drugs and taking post-mortem blood compared to ante-mortem blood.
We did not specifically discuss the issue of postmortem redistribution, but we did discuss the fact that a postmortem blood level may not be indicative of what that drug level was at the time of death.
Okay. Dilution of the blood in a drowning, is that going to have an effect on
I
the
think so,
levels?
yes.
Mr. Spencer went through a number of possible risk factors that would put Michelle MacNeill at risk of suffering an arrhythmia. You then indicated that determining the mechanism of death as an arrhythmia here is speculation.
Yes.
Purely speculation.
Yes, we have no physical tracings of her heart rhythm through the process of her dying, so we may think it is, but we cannot prove it.
And an arrhythmia is not a cause of death.
No. At least in the absence of some explanation for why the arrhythmia could have happened. I mean, a death certificate that says arrhythmia on it is a poor death certificate. It doesn't really say a cause of death. It doesn't tell you why that happened.
Okay. You ultimately issued an addendum in this case, changing the cause and manner of death.
Yes,
Adjusting the cause of death, changing the manner of death.
that is correct.
Did you do that due to any pressure by investigators?
No, I mean, you basically have no effect on my life, so I didn't have any pressure.
You are a professional,
Yes,
the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah.
right, and independent of the Utah County Attorney's Office, the AG's office, or any law enforcement agency.
I imagine you're bound by certain ethics in your position.
Yes,
What are those?
basic medical ethics.
Which are, as they apply here?
Do no harm in this case.
Can you describe this dilution of the blood due to if there's a drowning here, there's an increase in water in the blood?
You make tea. It's a certain color, a certain darkness. You then add more water to it. What changes? The color of the tea, the amount of stuff in there that is leading to the concentration of tea. It's somewhat similar in you have a blood volume, and then you have a certain concentration of drugs in there. You suddenly pour a bunch of fluid into that blood volume, it's going to change the concentration of the drug.
Whereas postmortem distribution may elevate.
Postmortem redistribution is a phenomena where certain drugs may get released from tissue back into the blood. So you take a sample while they're alive, and then you take a sample after they're dead, and you may see that that level has gone up.
And the dilution due to water in the blood would have the opposite effect
It could lower the concentration measured, yes.
of what was actually present in the antemortem.
Again, making the postmortem level, interpreting it versus vis-a-vis the antemortem level even more difficult, yes.
Okay. No more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you.
But you didn't see evidence in the lungs to indicate inhalation of significant amounts of water, correct?
I could not make that diagnosis, no.
And so, really, we're just speculating again about possible dilution, right?
Possible dilution from aspiration of water, yes, that is speculation. Possible dilution from the administration of fluids during resuscitation, that's probably more likely.
You testified at the preliminary hearing, though, that you don't know whether dilution from fluids
No.
made a difference, right?
As I said, one of the whole problems with going from postmortem back to antemortem is you have to make a bunch of assumptions. Do we assume that there was a delusional effect because she got lots of fluids during resuscitation? Well, we might, and that could be accurate, it could be inaccurate. The assumptions are what's going to kill you in terms of making that connection between postmortem and antemortem.
You just don't know whether,
I don't.
right?
We don't know, and I don't know how we could know unless somebody had taken blood samples while she was alive up until the point she's in the bathtub, and then serial samples after that.
And if we talk about the fluids from resuscitation efforts, that would be a fairly small percentage potentially of total blood volume, right?
Really does depend on how much she got. What I saw was she got about 1,100 cc's. Total blood volume in a person of her weight, let's see,
Right around 5,000 cc's?
83 kilograms, so 8 times 70, 5.5 liters.
How many cc's would that be?
70 cc's per kilogram is sort of a rough and dirty way of estimating blood volume.
I remember the pound weight, but not the,
83 kilograms.
that was, so 182 pounds is,
That's 83 kilograms. So 80 times 70 is 500, is 5,600. So we're talking about 5.5 liters. So 1,100 would be about 22%.
you're familiar with some ranges of postmortem redistribution?
Yes, I am.
And fair to say that the ranges of postmortem redistribution are considerably higher than 22% generally?
The ranges are usually expressed as a ratio from a central sample, where you draw a heart sample, to a peripheral sample. And for the various drugs, they can be quite different. For example, I think oxycodone was the one with the highest. It goes anywhere from a ratio of 1.2 on up to 5 or even 6. Some of the drugs may even have a ratio that is less than 1, meaning that a central sample might be lower than a peripheral sample. How do you know which ratio in that range is accurate for a specific individual? I don't know.
And so oxycodone, a range of 1.2 to 5.6, I'm sorry, to 5 or 6, and Valium, what's the range on that?
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't have hazard a guess. I'd want to look at it for sure. I think it's one which just goes like from 0.8 to,
12?
yeah, high.
And we just talked about this the other day. And Zolpidem,
Again, it has a range which is anywhere from a little below 1 to on up and higher.
up to as high as 3?
I'd have to check, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Promethazine?
Again, its range is, I think, a little over 1 on up.
Pardon me, Judge.
You may.
Okay, I'm showing you article from the Forensic Science International. Fair to say that's another article about postmortem redistribution?
That's the title.
And it's got an abstract on the front, but then a summary later on. But their studies found that zolpidem actually has maybe better to...
A CP ratio of 3.74 is what they're reporting.
3.74.
So that's one number. It's certainly not a range of what has been found in other studies.
Yeah, and that's an average. If you turn back a couple pages, it discusses their studies. It's the bottom line, Dr. Gray, is that there are lots of studies with lots of different numbers, right?
Yes.
And so it's just really hard to make any firm conclusions, as you've testified, in relation to living conditions based upon postmortem heart blood.
Yes, I
Right.
think we are further exploring that arena that I've already said is the connection between a postmortem blood level and an antemortem blood level is difficult to actually determine with accuracy.
And so while you suspected that there's a possibility that administration of fluids could have had a 20 to 22% dilution?
No, I didn't say that. I said dilutional effects were possible.
Possible, okay.
And the amount of fluid that she got represents about 20% of her blood volume.
Okay, so if we again engage in this speculation process and say that that could have had a dilutional effect on her blood in relation to the medications, 22% is way lower than even than generally the ranges of postmortem redistribution.
Certainly.
Right? So if we have oxycodone that goes up to 5 or 6, that's 6 times the amount if we take the high level, and if we have a postmortem sample with of central blood, then that could be 6 times greater
Right.
than the peripheral.
Yes, there is that possibility. So if you got a blood level of 6 centrally, it might be 1 peripherally. That's a possibility.
And the other problem is, even peripheral blood is not necessarily consistent with living conditions.
That is correct.
So there's ambiguity everywhere we turn, right?
Yes.
And when you've indicated that the blood levels based upon the postmortem heart blood sample that we have in this case are relatively low,
Yes.
you're doing your best to factor in all of these ambiguities. Is that right?
Certainly. That's one of the reasons this was certified as undetermined.
Okay. You indicated that that a diagnosis of an arrhythmia in response to Mr. Grunander's question is speculation.
That is correct.
You made that conclusion, however, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty based upon what you observed in Michelle's case, right?
No, I have never actually diagnosed arrhythmia. It's not a statement. It's not one of the factors in the cause of death. If you ask me what do I think the mechanism of death is, yeah, arrhythmia would be a fairly reasonable conclusion. But can I prove that? No.
And similarly with drowning,
It's a possibility. I cannot prove it.
and you saw less subjective evidence of drowning than you did for arrhythmia, correct?
No.
No? Can't prove either of them.
Arrhythmia, as I said, is something that leaves no footprints at all for me to see as a medical examiner after it's happened and the patient has died. Drowning is even though it's a fairly specific cause of death, the findings in the body are very non-specific. You get heavy fluid-filled lungs. Okay, that's consistent with somebody breathing in water. I can see the same pattern, same thing in somebody who dies of a narcotic overdose. I can see the same thing in patients who sometimes die as a result of a stroke. So those findings are not, again, specific and allow me to say, aha, that's exactly what I would expect to see in drowning, and I wouldn't expect to see it in anything else.
In fact, sometimes you see lung congestion for unexplained reasons.
That is correct.
So that's why it's called a non-specific finding.
Again, correct. It does not etiologically specific. It does not, that finding doesn't prove one thing versus many others.
And as you indicated in your letter, you don't believe that resuscitative efforts would have eliminated all findings that you would expect to possibly see in a drowning, correct?
No, they wouldn't eliminate them, but they certainly could obfuscate them, make them more difficult to interpret.
Okay. There are no signs in relation to drowning that a medical examiner can look at and say, ah, I see this, therefore there's a drowning.
Right. Drowning as a cause of death is pathologically difficult to prove.
And in in Dr. Fricke's certification as to the cause of death, she certified that it was due to natural cardiovascular disease.
That's what she originally certified, correct.
And you amended that.
I did.
And you said that you then certified the cause of death as being due to natural cardiovascular disease and possibly drug toxicity.
The combined effects of those two entities, yes.
That's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Anything further?
One last question, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Diazepam, oxycodone, promethazine, and zolpidem in the MacNeill system had a combined effect as to the cause of her death, correct?
I believe that they played a role, yes.
Thank you.
Do you have questions for Dr. Gray? If you do, pass them down the row, and the bailiff will collect them. Any more? Okay. Counsel, would you approach? Dr. Gray, just a few questions from the jury. If Michelle MacNeill had been given arnica, would there have been evidence of this?
I'm not sure what arnica is.
Do any of the drugs present in the toxicology report have, well, you're not sure what arnica is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a
Okay.
name I'm just not familiar with.
Very good. Counsel, the second question is moot in light of that answer. Is it possible for someone to suffocate in water without showing signs of drowning?
Yes, there is an entity that is called dry lung drowning. What that is it's hypothesized that when that person takes that first big gulp of water, it causes the muscles in their throat, their larynx, to actually spasm and contract, so that now they can't get anything in. So even though they're struggling and trying to get a breath, they can't suck water in. So dry lung drowning is theoretically a possibility.
How many blood samples did Dr. Fricke take from Michelle's heart, and from what locations?
Our standard is that we will take 3 individual tubes of blood in every case for testing. It is a heart in this case, she drew the sample from the heart. The specific location on the heart, I cannot be sure. I don't have a record of that or a photograph.
So 3 samples, all cardiac?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, one question inquired about redactions from the autopsy report. There's some information, as you've seen during the course of trial, both from witnesses as well as documents. There's some information that is not admissible, and you should not speculate on what has been excluded from the autopsy report. Dr. Gray, what is a Q...
May I interject?
Not right now, because counsel may have some follow-up questions. What is a QTC interval?
In an electrocardiogram, if you see the tracing, it goes blip, which is called the P wave, then there's a little flat part, and then it goes boop, 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 and that's the QRS, and then there's another flat part and another little blip that's called the T. And you can measure the amount of time it takes to go from that Q blip to the T blip, and if it's prolonged, that means you may be at greater risk for developing an arrhythmia.
Thank you. You stated that you thought that drowning was a possibility. What evidence was found in the autopsy that would suggest that, or was it purely from the conditions under which Michelle MacNeill was found?
In terms of the autopsy findings, the lung weights were increased. If I remember correctly, or well, I will remember, I'll read it. The lung weights were right lung 690 grams, left lung 670 grams. Those are heavier than normal. Generally speaking, normal lung weight's around 300, 400. That weight is explained by a finding of edema or fluid in the lung, as well as congestion, which is a backup of blood in the lungs. Edema certainly could be, you could interpret that as being an evidence of aspiration of water. Congestion is something you also can see in drowning events. Unfortunately, those 2 findings are also very common in people who have undergone prolonged resuscitation. So that's why I didn't think I could use those findings alone to prove drowning.
Thank you. Do you have follow-up questions?
Maybe just one, Your Honor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Based on Dr. Gray's reaction, there was a question about redaction of an autopsy report. Are you aware of any redactions in the autopsy
No,
report?
in the exhibits that I was given, the reports were not redacted. There was only redactions in the copies of Maureen's handwritten notes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Dr. Gray, in relation to the drawing of blood, you indicated that there were 3 vials of blood drawn from the heart.
Correct.
But there was also vitreous humor drawn as well, correct?
Yes.
And that's fluid from
The eyeball.
the eyeball? And that also could be tested for medication levels.
It could, yes.
And in this case, you're not aware of that ever having been done?
Not, there was no report of any testing of the vitreous for drugs. That is correct.
But if Dr. Fricke had a concern about the medication levels, she could have asked to have the...
Objections, speculation?
Well, it goes to what a medical examiner can or cannot do. I'll allow it.
She could have asked the toxicologist to check the vitreous humor as well, correct?
Yes, that would have been a test that could have been ordered.
Vitreous humor is typically less affected by postmortem redistribution, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And same with other variables such as dilution.
Correct.
And that's all the questions I have.
Me, redirect.
Dr. Fricke was a well-regarded, competent medical examiner. Is that correct?
I thought she was a really good pathologist, yes.
Thank you.
May Dr. Gray be released from his trial subpoena.
We would ask that he stay under his subpoena, Your Honor, just in case.
Okay, I'll order that you remain under subpoena. You may step down today. Thank you,
Am I
Dr.
also still under the court order not to look at the media?
I believe because he's an expert, he's not covered by that order.
That's correct.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
You may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess for the day. Thank you for staying a few minutes longer. As we recess for the evening, remember that it is your duty not to discuss any subject of the trial with each other or with anyone else, including family members or friends. It is your duty not to form or express any opinion on the case until it's finally submitted to you for deliberation. Avoid any television, radio, or internet news coverage of the trial, and do no research on your own using computers, iPads, or something else. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. Do you anticipate any housekeeping matters before we get started in the morning?
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
So, okay, let's start at 8:30 then. Thank you. Court's in recess.
All rise.
Who do you anticipate calling in the morning?
I believe we're going to call Dr. Cragen and then Dr. Perper.
And will that take the day?
If it was like today, I imagine it would.
Okay. How long do you think you'll be with these witnesses?
I think Dr. Cragen will be pretty quick.
Okay.
And I think that Dr. Perper will probably be comparable to Dr. Gray.
How long, maybe an hour and a half? Is that how long you were?
And you know, maybe not so long since we've covered a lot of ground with Dr. Gray. We may not.
Dr. Gray was just under 3 hours.
Was it that
Yeah.
long?
Yeah.
How long do you think you'll be with these witnesses on direct?
I think Dr. Cragen will probably be a half hour on direct, and Dr. Perper probably between an hour and an hour and a half. We still have Spencer Cannon from the Sheriff's Office, who is the medical examiner liaison, that we could call in as well.
Okay. So, assuming you both take an hour and a half with Dr. Perper, that's 3 hours. We're maybe looking at, I just don't want to run out of witnesses tomorrow, so you have Officer who?
Spencer Cannon, I believe he's a sergeant.
Okay. Anyone else? Will he be pretty quick, I would think?
I would think he'd probably be a half hour total,
Okay.
If that.
if that. I think after that is the inmates, and they're
We could-
easily accessible for us.
Okay, so you could get one or two of them here if need be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could you let us know which one you would have on top?
Would you just,
Absolutely talk about that.
yeah, why don't you disclose those to Mr. Spencer as to the order in which they might be called? Anything else today, then,
Not from the state.
from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for your work today. Court's in recess.